Thanks for agreeing to hop on a call with me and answer all of my nerdy questions. And everyone watching, thank you for joining us. For a little bit of context, obviously so many amazing features were released at Config, and right now I'm in the midst of updating my UI kit, UI prep, and my course, Design System Bootcamp, which is a 5-week course about building a design system in Figma. And to get ready for that and to get some new ideas, I'm studying Louis and the Figma team's newest community file release, the Simple Design System, which is an amazing resource, and I'm learning so much by going through it and studying all the little decisions that were made. And naturally, I have 1,000 questions. And so today I'm going to ask Louis just a few of them. And then we can also open up the floor.
You actually do have 1,000.
I do have 1,000 questions. Sorry, I got a little carried away. We might have to do these slightly rapid fire style. But I believe in us. I think we can do it.
We can.
Awesome. Let's see. All right, let's start with just a few kind of general ones. First, what type of teams was the Simple Design System made for? Who are you picturing as the system will be perfect for blank team?
It's a few different personas, and I can probably break those down into the different types of people we might be targeting with this kind of thing. The first one is probably someone like you, who is curious to know how we think about things from design perspective, code perspective, bringing those together or not in some cases, which we'll probably get into later. The second one is people who have never made a design system and would like to know maybe some foundational principles as they start getting going. So there's two ends of the spectrum there. Somebody like you who is very deep in this world and somebody who's maybe not and curious to get up to that level. Then internally, we see this as an opportunity to demonstrate what Jake calls a round trip of design to dev and showing how you can have that one-to-one parity in places and maybe not in others as a way to demonstrate our, in air quotes, best practice approach to how you might want to do that. And then we can use it for things like demonstration sessions, live streams, all that sorts of stuff. So a few core different groups of people who we think this could be really useful for.
Thanks. And while you guys were building it, was there anything that was like maybe harder or easier than you were expecting it would be?
I spent so long trying to build an alert component or a call out or a message or whatever it is. And I can't tell you how many discussions / arguments we had about the composition, the colors, the variants, the types, the schemes, all this sorts of stuff took an age, because what every team will end up doing when they're trying to build an alert component is do a neutral one, a success one, a warning one, a danger or error one. And you will hit a wall very quickly of color contrast problems, especially if you have actions that live inside of it. So we had an alert which had text, a close icon, and a button inside. Sounds fine. When you've multiplied the what we call schemes, which is the different color variations, by 4, and then try and place a colored button on top of those colors, you're in trouble. What we ended up doing was shipping a white background for the alert, because it made it so much easier for those pairings to come to life. Additionally, we went through the same problems of what does the brand color look like. It originally was similar to the Figma blue. Then it went somewhere else like purple. And this was just through experimentation, just to try and find what works. We ended up with a very dark gray as the brand color, which is almost like a non-color. However, that introduced different problems, because when your neutrals are gray and your brand color is gray, you find it very difficult to test these combinations. And it wasn't until, I don't know, the night before or the day before where Jake, who I worked with on this, said to me, Louis, why is the border default aliasing the brand color? And that was just about before we went live. And I was like, I don't know. I think it's just because they look the same, and I just referenced or aliased in a grey color, but that was the brand. So those were sounds like seemingly small things, but challenging to test with.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was surprised by your answer, but it also makes perfect sense. I feel like in my course, some of the first components I have people make is the button and the alert. Not because they're necessarily the most important, but if you can make your colors work with those types of components, then they're going to work for everything else. It's a great hurdle to get over and just like test everything. Like, what can text be and not be on? And where do we need to make some optimizations?
I would advise. Well, so what makes the alert problem even more complicated is that we had color combinations. So the text was a dark green on a light green for the success one. The alert one or danger one was a dark red on a light red. So I would advise you, if you go down that route, don't do a color combination as well, because that would make it even more difficult to do the pairing.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's jump into some questions around typography variables. Let's see, it might be easier if you share your screen, if you have that file pulled up.
Yeah. Let me just open that. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Nice. All right, perfect. So my first question for you is, to get some context, do you think typography variables are a must for all design systems, or are they only worthwhile for maybe larger and more complex products?
I would say no. And in fact, I'd go a bit further and say variables aren't a requirement for every uh, product until you need them. And that to me means when you need to make changes on a mode level, that's when you introduce a variable. And if you're just a scrappy startup where you're still proving your product or trying to get your early customers or going to market, probably don't need modes. You probably don't need a light mode and a dark mode. You probably don't need modes for typography switching like platforms. So no, in that instance. And it's definitely a benefit when you get to a more mature system where you need to make batch changes at scale. And that made this pretty hard because this is a simple design system, but we needed to demonstrate how you might go and think about it. And some of the other questions might address this, so I won't go too deep into that. But in short, no, not every system needs it. I'd say you need to introduce these variables when you get to a point where you need to start scaling. Zoomed in on here, although these actually do use the same font size and line height, they might not in the real world scenario. You might have a larger font size on mobile for the body text, in which case a mode switch might be beneficial to you in that instance. The way that we've structured these is they're actually using a different variant component for the different breakpoints instead of different typography modes.
Do you think it would be beneficial to use just a semantic collection for all of your typography variables, or do you think it's almost always beneficial to have both the primitive and the semantic collections working in tandem?
This is another example of the simple design system maybe doing something that is not necessarily simple, but a way to set a foundation of how you might want to think through things. So I might just actually increase my Figma here. So in the collections within simple design system, we have this typography primitives and a typography collection. And what you might not need in your system when you're starting is the primitives collection. Or you might not need the typography collection. And I'll run through what those look like just very quickly. So on the style side, we have a set of text styles which run from titles, headings, body, downwards. These are then matched in groups in the collection for typography. So you'll see title hero matches the name of title hero. These values then get pushed into the style of title hero. Same for body. We've got font family, a size, a weight, and a style pushed into the body style. These are pulling in references from the typography primitives for the font family and the style or weight. So if I head back, you can see scale is being pulled in from there. font family is being pulled in from there, and font weight is being pulled in from there. You might not need to do this level of like belt and braces approach to managing your typography styles or variables in that case, if your system is small. If you're also aligning to a different framework, they might have a very opinionated way to build typography scales or structures. The way that we've done this is mostly for efficiency. So this is where that friction of like simple versus complex comes back, because the pairing between the style and the variable group enables changes at scale. When we initially were setting the styles up, we had loads more. So there was like 3 types of heading. There was 3 types of body in size difference. And anytime I wanted to make a change to a single one, for example, changing the body family, I'd have to go through every single style and manually change the font family in there. What we found was way more efficient was to outsource that style management into variables. So where are we? Body here. If all the body, so you can see we've got body base, strong, emphasis, link, small, etc., etc. If all of those font family needs to change, we're in trouble, especially if our system stretches across multiple different files and brands. That's why relying on a single font family variable to push in to all of those different styles means we can change the font family from one place to affect X number of styles. So that grouping enables us to do batch changes in the system to affect all the different style variations that we might have anywhere in the effectively ecosystem of our design system. And you can see in this one, in the responsive collection, we do have different modes, but these aren't really used. This is an experiment that we set up before to try and work on a more dynamic scale approach using calculations for the font sizes, but it didn't really scale as well as we want, and it might have introduced more complexity for a simple system. So what in the responsive collection is actually just trying to be future thinking and aligning more with the code implementation. So this scale variable that we have does actually reference the rem-based decision that we've made in CSS. It's just not replicated in the Figma version.
And I know there's some questions about modes in the chat. If you want an example of the modes, you can always experiment with the color modes, because you guys do support light and dark modes in the simple design systems. You can experiment with just like how that feature even works using colors, just not with text right now.
Exactly. So in the color examples, we've got color primitives, where probably no surprise here, we've got a bunch of different colors with a 1 to 1,000 ramp, and I'll explain that in a second. So pink, gray, red. This was intentionally kept minimal because we didn't want it to be too variant in what you can see, and we wanted it to be an example for somebody to take the file and add their own ramps in there. All the ones we use here are used in the file, so we just wanted to keep that as lean as possible. There is one thing that I wanted to show here, though, which is a brand primitive. This is probably not the most normal thing to do in a primitive collection, but enabling a brand ramp, which again is the gray, which became quite difficult, meant that I could make changes in one place, again, like the typography example, in tons of different places. So jumping over to the color, which is where we get to the semantic level, we have our modes, SDS, standing for Simple Design System, light and dark. And if I jump to background brand, you can see we're referencing brand. And text brand is referencing the brand primitive. Border brand referencing the brand primitive. Icon brand primitive. So these enable us to say, okay, brand 800 is now going to be purple, and it would just propagate down to all the different permutations of that semantic variable.
Nice. That leads me to my next question, comparing how the color variables are organized compared to the text variables.
Yeah.
So the first thing is I noticed with colors, especially for the primitive colors, you utilize the groups, which is really helpful. We have these different groups on that side panel for brand, black, white, all those different kind of categories of color. And I noticed that for the typography primitives, you don't use groups. Everything is just in one big bucket. Is that just because there's less of them, or was there more some strategy behind that?
Honestly, because I forgot, I think there probably could be an argument to say that you never ever want to see the primitives So the organization doesn't really matter. But
Mhm.
to be honest with you, that would just be an excuse. And the answer probably that they should be grouped: family, scale, and style. The
Mhm.
challenge that would introduce, though, is that it will break our code connection. So anytime we want to make a variable change, and let me just show you quickly what I mean by that. If I jump into dev mode, I'm in a different file. So we do have Simple Design Systems set up with Code Connect, and that means that there should be a preview of the code on the right-hand side in dev mode, and I don't want to break any connections to the variables. So if I went and changed the variable structure, I'd need to do that in tandem with the code release to make sure we're doing it at the same time. So in the future, we might end up grouping these, but these are, as I said, they're set once and forget. So it might not be that important. But I would definitely do in the future, if I was doing another system, group these up.
My next question about organization is that for the typography variables, the semantic ones, I noticed they're organized by the kind of text style that they're going to be used for. It's like heading, body, subheader, things like that, instead of the property type, like all the families, all the weights. Is that just a preference, or is there some strategy behind that?
In this typography, like the semantic-ish collection,
You have like all the heading primitives grouped together for the heading, versus I guess really the only other way to organize I can see would be like all of the size variables are listed and categorized in one group.
yeah, I think
And
it's
then all the
mostly just for discoverability and to find things. We intentionally kept the type options very limited. This might be a really small subset of what you may end up having in your production product. And that may mean that you change the structure. But for us, we wanted to keep it as lean as possible. And that meant that the style option list was pretty much the smallest thing we could get away with, while still supporting many different use cases in the system. So we just wanted to match effectively what in the style panel and keep it as lean as possible for discoverability. You could probably meet somewhere in the middle of just an endless list or tightly grouped list. There might be another group that you introduced for headings, in which case you have all of these in one group in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That might be something that you do. But again, you'd have to make sure you replicate that on the code side as well, or
Yeah.
synchronize it if you're doing that.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed with each of these groups that correspond to the text style, there are multiple sizes
Yeah.
available. So for example, page title and subheader, they each have a few different size options. There's small, base, and large. And then in the style, you're only choosing to use one of them. Can you walk through the strategy for that?
Yeah. This was another one of those situations where we thought we want to show maybe what you could do, but not be prescriptive about what that is. So a body is a pretty good example where we struggled actually a lot with how do we organize different sized bodies? We have this body base, which is 16. We have body small, which is 14. Should that be a slash naming convention? Should it be a group? Or should it be named something different? Should body small be caption or something like that? And there's no, because it might not be a caption when you use it. What I wanted to enable with this is that as a system maintainer, you probably want to restrict some things, but enable flexibility within the system to a certain degree. And as an example of that, you might have 3 different size variations of a title across a multi-product system. In which case, you might want to say, these are the guardrails of small to large of what a title could be in our brand. So when we enable you as a designer to create your own style, you can compose your own style using the options available within title page group. Additionally, as a system maintainer, you might not know that, but you might be changing a style's composition and realize that when I'm changing the size, I've got a couple of options that I can choose from. And that just drives me down a path of limitation, but flexibility within that limitation, if that makes any sense.
Okay. So is the
Additionally,
expectation with,
sorry, just one more thing on that as
oh yeah.
well, is that if you do need to extend it, so if you do need more styles of title page small, title page medium, title page large, they're already set up for you. So you can just extend it that way.
Okay. So with this system, is it the expectation that designers could go in and update the styles for a particular design file? Or, hey, here's our one large global design system for this whole product. Maybe we do styles a little differently. When would you expect users or designers to make these customizations?
Something that I find that's pretty common within systems teams is an inability to keep up with the requirements of the consumers of it. And that might mean that you're working on a landing page and you need a slightly larger title, but the pipeline to come back to me as a system maintainer to create the style, publish it out as a version, consume it in your file might be way too long compared to the deadline of the project, for example. So this might enable you to create your own local style, consuming the variables of the system. So you know all that stuff's kind of locked down and signed off to continue your work before it officially gets contributed back to the system. You might just need like a snowflake style in your design. Whereas if it's used in 2 projects or features, then we know it needs to be bubbled up towards the system. So it's more about enabling that flexibility within your own interpretations of these guardrails I mentioned.
Okay, so would the kind of ideal use case be that maybe a designer creates a brand new style and kind of pulls from these suggested variables instead of going in and changing, let's say, body base to be slightly bigger?
Yeah, so more about extension rather than changing that core foundation.
Okay, that makes sense. Because I was going to say, I would be worried that when one file body base is 16 pixels and then another file body base is 18 pixels, that might be confusing, especially for the developers.
Yeah, exactly. So in that case, we hit a wall of, wait, does body base even make sense? Is it actually body medium? And that naming convention is really tricky to figure out. The reason I used base and not medium and not default is because to me they mean something. They mean something very specific towards size, or they mean something very specific towards reserved words in code. So if we use a default, we might end up in a situation, firstly, of something like default/default. And that is an annoying frustration of like composing components or variables generally. And we don't want that. So I've generally leaned towards something more like base for, oh, that's definitely not size related. However, if we used body/medium, I might be thinking, wait, where's body? Where are the other t-shirt sizes of this? Whereas feeding in the medium from the variable to a more generic style, I don't need to look at the style list and think about size. I just think about the implementation of it.
Yeah, I like that. I love using base for certain things when it's the thing you should be reaching for most often. But sometimes the word default, I'm tempted to use the word default, but that kind of implies there's also like a hover state or something, or it's somehow active.
Yes.
So base is a nice, okay, this is what I should reach for, but default, but it's not really default. Yeah, just most of the time.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like the most vanilla version of that thing.
Yeah, it's just like a non-stateful default kind of.
Yeah.
I noticed that you use base in place of medium in some of your variable names. You just mentioned this, but there's like a specific time where you chose between the two, even though you have small and large, but then the middle one you chose base instead of medium.
Yeah. I think that I wanted it to be, so another word that I did consider was normal. But that also means some things in different places. So it's just a very difficult naming problem, really, of it could have shipped as just body without a suffix on it. And that might have been fine. I think it might just be because we have body strong, body emphasis, body link, body small strong, body code, that it needed to align with that kind of naming convention. And I wanted it to be as generic as possible, but to indicate that it is the default, but not the default option that you can and should be using within any body text that is, for example, this like dialogue text should be body based.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's a great vanilla word to be using. I definitely use it in my system as well. Okay, another question I have. was about typography weight. Before I get to my real question, can you just like really briefly explain some of the pros and cons of using the two options? So for a text weight, you can use a text variable or a number variable.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's some go either way depending on your team and your preferences.
It's very frustrating. Firstly, the challenge that you have is that a lot of fonts / most fonts have a different name for different weights as a word. Let's just take a look here. So if I do this and just attach the stuff, if I make this inter and semi-bold, so inter semi-bold is semi-space bold. If I go to Roboto, it's semi-bold, no space. So they're the same definition of weight, but different words for that weight. They also might not necessarily map to a number scale. So in CSS, you might have like 400 for regular, 700 for bold, and I think 500 is semi-bold. So these numbers would map to this. You can see it changes, semi-bold. But not every font references them like that, which is a challenge. So sometimes you have to use a word, but this is also a challenge with Figma, because if you wanted to have semi-bold italic, there's no number that represents that. It's the word. So that's why you'd have to have written out semi-bold italic as your variable name for that weight, which is why I'm mixing numbers and strings. Numbers for the CSS 1 to 900 scale, and then words for the style variation of a weight. So if it's bold italic, it's the word. If it's bold, it's 700.
Okay.
Which means you need to have more, you need to make more variables to match these.
Perfect. That was my next question. Why mix? I have the text and the numbers. Which
we're in trouble here from a systems point of view. Additionally, each font you want to support in your system would need different words. So this extra light italic maps to, let's just change this to inter extra light italic. That word maps directly to this word in the string. But as I said before, this semi-bold italic, if I was using Roboto, would have to be no space in between semi and bold. So I'd need to make another variable for that, which is where you would introduce groups in those primitives. I would have a group for each different font that I'm using and the different weight for each different font. So inter weights, Roboto weights, Sego UI weights.
Okay. I think this all makes sense. I get how we got here with the text and the number variables. But what I get hung up on is, let's say I'm supporting italic for all these different fonts. I'm going to have to go in and support the text variable for all the italic ones anyways. Would it just be easier for like my own brain to just make them all text and just fix everything while I'm in there?
You could do that. What you would have to do, so for example, do you mean like weight regular, just writing regular in here?
Exactly.
Yeah, that relies on every font having the same word for regular. Some of them might use something like book instead of regular, which means you'd need more variables. So the number scale is a good fallback, but you still have to test it out, just because not every font uses the same matching for numbers and the weights that you want. So this is a really laborious task of going through every font you want to support, finding out how the names map, finding out the name of the styles, and then unfortunately creating a variable for every single one if you need to.
Yes, I guess regular would be the one exception, because you don't even need a word for it. You can just skip straight to italic. You can skip the first half of that one. But for like light...
For inter, yes.
Yes, I guess for inter.
Yeah.
But for like light, medium, semi-bold, extra bold, you'll have to kind of look up what the text, if it, say you're changing font families, like what the text is for the next font family and go in and change it for the italic ones, right?
Yes, I'm just looking here. This Roboto is just italic. If I change it to, I don't know, what's this? Road Rage. They don't have it. They don't have italic. They go to Roboto Flex. What do they use? Italic. Yeah. So there's some fonts that don't. I could probably find one if I just scroll here endlessly. But there's some fonts that will just use a different word for italic.
Okay.
It might be regular italic, for example.
Like slanted. No one says slanted. I don't know.
Oh, Tego doesn't even have it. The option. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So some fonts just have a different word for it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Do we see any other solutions or features around text weight coming in the near or far future, or is this kind of just make our peace with how it is now?
Figma will definitely improve that at some point, and that will, without committing to what it would be, my hope is that there's two fields. So when you're making your text object, you see the font weight and the font style as two fields. So you'll be able to say this is bold and it's italic, not bold italic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That would be the hope. That would be the hope for me, so that you can then split those mappings out.
Nice. Is the other alternative just calling every single font creator and telling them to standardize their names?
Pretty much. That's what you've got to do.
Hey guys, this is the new plan. Let's all get on board.
Yeah. Petition.
Petition. It could work. Who knows? Okay, so that answers my question about weight. Let's see what's next. Base medium. Yes, I noticed for the typography primitives, for the number for the different sizes of the text, you describe them as scale instead of size. Can you explain that choice a little bit?
Yeah, it's mostly because we wanted to match to a REM-based CSS scale as like a calculation and not a specific pixel value size. So this is another example of where the code and design get deviated, but we still have the same ideas that we want to get to at the end. In the CSS version, it does have a REM-based scaling. It's just in Figma we couldn't do that. And that the easiest way to meet in the middle was to just call it something generic like scale, and just know on either side that we're doing different things, but we still want to be meeting in the same place.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm just going to pull up a screenshot of that, the CSS for this as well, just so you can see. If I just put this on the canvas, so you can see we've got, this isn't specifically the typography stuff, but you can see the CSS is using those REMs for sizing. They're not just the pixel values that we have. And these map in name to what we were doing, but not in value to what we're doing in the Figma side.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. I think if you're going to do primitives for typography, I think scale makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it just makes it generic enough without being like, this is the pixels.
You can always little flexibility change things around a little bit. For the text styles, I know you have a very nice, pretty simple list. No never-ending list or like lots and lots of folders and subfolders for these different text styles. Can you walk through any of the, I guess, like decisions or like things you guys were thinking about when coming up with these names? There's always so many ways to name everything. Do you do heading 1, 2, and 3? Do you do body or paragraph? There's just so many endless, maybe pointless conversations about labels. What things were you guys thinking about?
This also took a long time to pare down. There was originally multiple heading sizes, and it became really difficult to name them because I didn't find or feel that heading 1, heading 2, heading 3 was useful in like a semantic naming way. But I know that Material were doing something similar. And I was like trying to figure out, but is this kind of what we want to do, or is this actually just creating confusion for who the audience might be in a simple context? The original examples that we have in the file here, so there's a bunch of screens that are pre-composed that you can use. These were an experiment that was done internally for preloaded kits in the community. So this was like seeding this idea. And they had these examples, which I then modified and applied the simple design system on top. And they had very clear definition of structure. So there was a hero, there was like a body thing, there was like a subtitle in there. And that naturally forced out the type styles. That what we were calling them was the challenge. And we ended up actually deleting a bunch of the different type sizes to try and keep it as simple as possible. As kind of the point on the color stuff, we wanted this to be extendable. So, and we felt like this was the quickest way and the simplest way to demonstrate a varying set of typography approaches without being too prescriptive about how you do it. What's also important is that these are web templates. There's no indication about how this might translate down to mobile for the font sizes, which is a different challenge. And that's something we didn't really get around to, or might not even get around to, is figuring out how that changes for different breakpoints or different platforms. This is very specifically a web-based typography ramp.
That makes sense. And let's say you're using a system and you want to have a second header or a second subtitle. What would your recommendation be for expanding on this system of naming?
I think there's a few things you could do. You could lean in like the body does and have heading small as just two words. If you need 3 sizes, you might want to start thinking about how that changes the architecture of the whole styles themselves. And you might end up with a heading group of small, medium, large. Or you might get even more specific with what it is for. It might not be a heading. It might be like an eyebrow. You might give it a more semantic specific name for that use case that you need. Like this thing here might only ever live on the contact us page, centrally aligned in this font size, in which case it might require a different title for that style. It might not be titled hero. It might be something else. It might be promo title, because it might only be used in that specific instance. So that's where I'd maybe question the naming convention, if it needs to be extended or if it needs to be a brand new thing. But extension, it might be new group and then sizes within the group. And for a different semantic exploration, it might just be a new named thing.
Nice. And with these names, would you recommend a team using the system to have their developers use the exact same names, like H1, H2, H3?
The first question I'd ask them is, do your developers want to, or are they using a framework? And then if they're using front-end framework, they might be just using a utility class system of like size 8, body font, body sans serif or something to compose that heading style. There might not even be a concept of a style in that simplistic title hero way. If you can, align the names, but I'm not going to be too prescriptive about them having to be identical. And there's a pretty good example in Simple Design System of this not being the same in the colors, actually in every single variable. So what you probably notice is that they're all in like uppercase names and there's no dashes. There's always a space between every single variable name. So it's background, default, uppercase D, default space, uppercase H, hover, because I want it to be as readable as possible for designers. Whereas on the code side, Jake wrote a script to hyphenate every space, lowercase every variable. So on the engineering side, they're reading lowercase background dash default dash hover. On the design side, we're searching for background space, default space, hover. And that deviation I think is really useful for adopting the system in your space, but enabling them to meet in the middle of the words are still the same, just structured very differently.
Okay. Was he able to go in there and just do that once? Or is that something that needs to be done and redone as you're copying and pasting code snippets and using all these dev tools?
Yeah. So once we aligned on this token schema, that was when the point of like export, write the script, generate the new naming conventions was done. If we add a new one, we then need to do that again, and a new one, do it again, a new one, do it again. But the script became really useful. And in particular, and this is not even related to the variable side, on things like icons, which I think you've got questions on too. The icons have keywords, and those keywords were also written by a script. And Jake injected those keywords into every component via a script instead of me going and typing every keyword for 100 icons or however many icons we have in here. It probably saved hours of time. So that injection of code was really efficient for variable naming, aligning on conventions, component descriptions, and aliasing as well.
Nice. That's so handy. If like typing all those keywords, it would be quite the task. While we're on icons, I do have a few questions. The biggest one is, can you walk me through your decision to support icon sizes using variants instead of size variables?
So the answer could be pretty short, in that we're using the feather icons kit in this library file, and they have these 6 sizes available in there. Is effectively, I exported all, I think it was 240 or something icons, and then organized them on the canvas, renamed them, and then batch created variants based off of that to match the sizing convention that Feather Icons has. So that's pretty much the only reason. I maybe would have considered a mode switch for size, but that would have meant introducing like a density scale on the variable side everywhere. I would have wanted different padding options. I would have wanted different height options. I would have wanted different width options based off that size toggle in a mode. And it just wasn't quite ready to go to that level of detail on this. Additionally, they have different stroke widths. So this one, you can see it has a 1.6 pixel stroke width, whereas this one is a 4. And we could have probably done that variable as well, but it just felt like a level of detail we didn't need to go through. And the variance with sizes was just enough for that use case.
Nice. Would you say it would be to just have one icon size, say like 24 by 24 for all of your icons, and then just creating a size variable for your icons, say like small is 16, medium is 24, I don't know, 32 is large. Would you caution against that system?
I think that it might be more trouble than it's worth, just because on the code side, you're not going to be doing a mode switch for different sizes of icons. You might just be swapping in an individual variable to change the size, or even not even variable. You might just have a hard-coded value. I'm not sure.
Or not even to use it
like work.
Not even to use it for different modes, but just to have, okay, I can add in my icon from the assets panel, and then I can just use a little variable drop down to select, should this icon be small, medium, or large?
Yeah, I think if your stroke width is consistent across different icons, yes, then definitely that's worth considering. I just think it might put you into a corner of, we don't have a variable for 36 height icon in this specific use that I need. Then you haven't using magic numbers in your system. So I just didn't get there to try and see that as a problem that we could solve. Maybe ironically is that I think we only use one size icon in the kit anyway. All these other ones are probably not required, but just as an example of what you can use in there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I notice that you still do have in your variables a collection, in the size collection, you have a group for icon. Is that being used anywhere?
No. I think we considered it, and let me just double check it. I don't think so. No, we didn't end up using it. That was just an exploration again of what you can consider doing if you go down that route. But we didn't actually end up doing that. You see also the stroke one, that could have the icon stroke size as a variable in there too. We just kept it as clean as we could with a border and focus ring one. So it's like that's where the extendable side could come into play.
Nice. I'm always flip-flopping between how I want to handle my icons. We've come a long way from the icon wrapper, I feel like. Let's see, what next?
Also, just on the icons, we do use icon variable sizes on the code side. just not the design side. So those like these, similar to the responsive collection with the root size and the scale, not used in design, but referenced in code as a thing that we're trying to connect together.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, nice to have for documentation and reference. For the size variables or the size collection, would you describe this whole collection as being semantic, primitive, a combination of both? Or do you not get caught up on how you define it?
I think this is one of the hardest things to name, is number variables in things like radius, depth. We flip-flopped back and forward between the radius names. They were t-shirt sized, and then they were an attempt at some sort of semantic naming of like tight and loose and that sort of thing. And it ended up with lots of different, very similar values for different names. And we thought that surely that can be consolidated down. So these are actually the same value, like depth 100 and radius 100 are the same value. That could just be a single variable, arguably. But we found it useful for discovery from a designer's point of view to say, I'm looking for radius 100 instead of I'm looking for 100. Like, what does 100 mean? Probably nothing.
Yeah.
And I think if I remember rightly, this aligns pretty well with the Atlassian system of naming conventions for stuff like size, where they use this number scale. And it just felt like it hit the right level of complexity for what we needed. But yeah, you can see how this becomes tricky when you introduce like a negative. It becomes quite funky. So it's just really difficult to know what the correct name is for that, because depth 025 in my head is what does it actually mean? Unless you know the system. But over time, hopefully that becomes clearer.
Does it ever bother you that you don't use 000 for the first one? So it can all be 3 numbers?
It just didn't.
Yeah, I saw 025 and I was like, oh, genius. Yeah. Now they all match. I was like, oh, but 0 is still so little.
I'm gonna have nightmares now.
Oh, no. No, don't. 0 is perfect. It's meant to be 1. That leads me to my next question. What is depth used for? What are you using that variable for as you design?
That is used for effects. Okay. If I go to the composition guide and head over, no, not the composition guide, the foundations. In effects, this is where we're pulling in, you can see 100, 200, 300, etc. That matches drop shadow 200, matches the variables. So that's where that naming actually does align. So if you're looking for depth as a scale, depth 600, you would use the 600 variable inside. So you can get that link, but you don't necessarily need to know that a variable exists inside it. It's just up number means larger effect.
That makes sense. All right. So I have 1,000 more questions, but it's also coming with an hour. Do you need to hop off right in the hour, or do you have more time, or what's your time? One more time? Okay. I do too. So let's keep going. I guess while we're talking about size, I noticed you use 2 questions. For size, you use it for both padding and space, like space between 2 objects. Do you ever see a world where it makes sense to have separate variables for those, or does it make perfect sense for them to just always be the same?
Originally, there was a separate group for gap or space between padding. Yeah, so they were originally different. And Jake said to me, these have the same value and they have very similar name, and it's just more variables. So can we consolidate those down into a more generic variable, which would be the spacer? And the answer was like, yeah, that actually does make sense. It makes it less, like you have to learn less things in the system to be able to use it effectively. But yeah, the previous system was way larger. These are just sticker sheet versions of what it looks like, but space gap and space padding all use the same space variable, regardless of whether it goes in this input field or this input field.
Yeah, that makes all sense. I think right now in my UI prep, they are separate, but they might as well be the same. They're very similar.
Yeah, I've got a similar feeling about color variables, really.
Mhm.
The icon and text. So if we try and find an example, let's take this out here. If I stick an icon on, the icon and the text are using the same color, but different variables. So we've got text. If I select this, we've got text brand on brand and icon brand on brand. Same name, different group. Arguably, they should be the same variable because it's the same thing.
Yeah.
There's an argument to suggest it should just be a foreground variable. But for this instance, and for more like a future thing we might be doing, it's logical for us to have them as different variables for different explorations. So in a more simpler system, I'd probably just consolidate it down to background and foreground.
I do like that. That's something we discussed by course too. That's an interesting decision point. You can have them be separate, variable colors and variables for just text, just icons, or combine them.
Mm-hmm.
I think I also fall on the side of keeping them separate, mostly for accessibility, because sometimes you need text to be slightly have a stronger contrast, and you can get away with some icons being a little bit softer. And I think having that flexibility is helpful long term.
Yeah, it's a stylistic choice. So if your system does have a more subtle icon against the text, then it would make sense for it to be a separate thing. Or it might be like a foreground, primary, secondary, tertiary, which goes down in, as you look, like Figma's system does use opacity for these kind of things, and the tertiary text would be a low opacity version of the primary text.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's a tough call, but in general, I prefer separate too. While we're kind of talking about components for a second, I noticed some of your components still use the / in the beginning of the name. I think mostly these little annotations. Is there a reason that you sometimes prefer to use that method of hiding something from the team library instead of just unchecking it when you're publishing?
Like this kind of underscore.
Mm-hmm. You can use like a period or underscore at the beginning of a component, and then it'll remain hidden from the team library.
Yeah. I've actually just noticed that this one uses a period and this one uses
They both work.
It's mostly as a double protection mechanism for me. I think that anytime I can reduce the margin for error, I'll do it. And although I could just mark them as not published or uncheck them at the point of publish, I know that if somebody else may be wanting to publish, they might think, oh, this has been unchecked by mistake. Let me go and publish this out. So I just want to be belt and braces with regards to this should never, ever be surfaced in a
this
design
can't see
file.
the light of day.
Exactly. But arguably, this might be useful for a designer mocking up their feature flows. This stuff might be useful, so you may reconsider that. But generally, yeah, I'll do an underscore and make it not publishable, and etc. etc.
Is there any reason to have caution adding the underscore period to any other components, especially smaller ones that might be nested inside of a larger component?
There is a challenge or a problem where if you use, you could call them fragments or base components or subcomponents within other ones. I don't think we have, let me just see. So I used before in a previous version, we abstracted out, for example, the label as its own component and the description as its own component. It's tempting to do that and then not publish those, but just inherit them into that main component, which is cool because you can manage batch changes in multiple different other components. However, if you make an update to the base component and then publish it out, your design file may not receive that update. So you need to be very careful with changes on hidden components because your system change may never actually update within the designer's file because it correctly is hidden. And it's like we don't need to see this thing. So you'd need to go in manually and update every single instance of that hidden component within the component, which is a challenge. So that's why based components are really useful, but are challenging as well at scale. If you're the only person working on the system, it might be totally fine. If there's 200, it might be a big problem.
Yeah, if it's one file, you're probably good. But once things get a little bigger, that makes sense. Yeah, in general, favor just clicking out, deselecting it on the publish library versus using the period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I feel like everyone always wants to know this. Did you use any particular tool to generate all of the colors in the system?
No, I didn't.
Or did you just go in and tinker?
I used every tool in the market. No,
made a mega tool?
Yeah. So this token schema was inherited from the Figma one. So the Figma token variable setup does match very closely to the naming conventions and the values that are used. But when I was playing around, I'm just going to put other things into this file. Just give me 1 second. When I was playing around with color contrasts and regression testing and all this sorts of stuff, I found, I'm just going to create a new page here. So this was all my, as pasting, it might take a while. This was all my exploration on color pairing that I was mentioning before on the alert. So you can see how many different variations of color and style all these sorts of things did. So I was testing these out on light mode, on dark mode. This is my very expert regression testing on color contrast. You can see the variations changed. Again, this is when I was starting to play around with orange and yellow quite a lot, which became impossible. I don't recommend trying to do that. You very quickly...
Yellow, why does yellow have to exist?
Yeah, exactly. Lots of different explorations here of the different types of that color. So I was playing around with other different colors, and you can see like a mini ramp that I created as an example of this. But ultimately, we decided to abandon that. So I was using lots of tools to create the color shades, and that was mostly just fine tweaks. So I wanted to make sure that every single color met a certain ratio in its usage for WCAG guidelines. And that meant just tweaking things up and down slightly based off the original 1 to 1000 primitive ramp.
Nice. I like that. I would love, there's one article by, I think, the Tailwind team comparing creating these color ramps. It's both a science and an art. Like, start with some tools and get like a good base, but then also you're a designer, use your eye to make sure things look just right for the branding. I like that take.
Absolutely. And I'm not a color expert at all, but this was a really nice exercise to know the challenges that people would face.
It always takes so much longer. That's always a big hurdle to get over in my course too, of just figuring out the colors. Lots of people think it's going to take just a couple hours to spin up the full color ramp. But once you start testing contrast and everything, you're going to fall into some challenges.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Okay, another question I definitely want to get to. I noticed all of your components have been placed on top of sections. Is there a strategy to this? It's just a bit of extra organization. Tell me about it.
Yeah, there is a strategy. There's a reason. So just to show you if you haven't seen it, this actually has a section around it.
It's subtle,
so I selected
but it's
that section. Very subtle, and you can see there's no name on the section. And it has a very specific F5, F5, F5 background and a very specific stroke definition for a reason. And this reason is the assets panel. So in the assets panel, we have the iOS kit, the material kit, and the simple design system kit, and they all look the same. So we wanted all of the kits to have a same presentation in the assets panel with their background color. And the way to do that was to make them all in a section or a frame with the same hex value. So all of the kits have the same approach to showing assets in the assets panel, and it works as close as possible on light and dark mode. So I'm just going to see if I can simulate that. So in dark mode, you still get the same 5. As it looks okay.
It's like as usually dark mode, it changes the canvas color to be dark, and you don't want that change.
This is because I've fixed it as this value.
Okay.
But the Yeah, so that section approach was for us to try and fix as much as possible the three of the kits in their presentation. Also because the iOS kit uses a lot of transparency in their components, and not having a color meant that I think it was in dark mode, you couldn't see the component because it was just like through.
Uh-huh.
So we had to introduce a color to fix that problem, and then we wanted to make them all kind of the same.
Okay. I've done something similar where often I'll make for like a component set with many variants. Instead of a white background, I'll just change that to like one of my style backgrounds to be like completely white, or my default dark background. One, because even as I'm designing the component, I love seeing it on the background it's going to be on later. And then two, like you're mentioning, it's easier to see in the assets panel, especially if it's like a bunch of white text and icons. Yes. You're going to want a dark background so you can actually know what you're pulling in.
Exactly. So I think the reason really is because it was multiple files. It was the three kits together that kind of needed to be some way harmonious. And that's also why there was no name on the section, because that would have introduced another level to the assets panel of the nesting. So it had to be like a weird specific approach.
Okay. I like that. Let's see. One other kind of random question. I noticed for the component sets with multiple variants, you have like a thick black dashed line around them. Maybe one of these.
Yeah.
Instead of the little purple dashes, this is just to be cool, or what's going on here?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Just to be cool.
The border neutral variable. And it's, I guess, to feel harmonious-ish with the annotation being gray and to allow the component to stand out. But it was really just me just playing around and wanting to be difficult.
It's for your own satisfaction as person in this file the most.
I have to change everything. I'm a designer.
Fair enough. I thought so, and it does look cool. So well done. Okay, let's see. What questions do I have? Also, do you have any questions in the chat while I peruse mine that we can get to?
There was one about danger buttons somewhere.
Ooh, okay.
What's the advantage of separating the normal button with the danger button in another component and not using variants? This is mostly for usage and discoverability. So in the assets panel, I'm going to go to buttons and I can see the options. That's pretty much surfacing visually what I might need as a designer. On the code side, I think they're exactly the same component. But on the design side, it's more work to configure something to be danger than to just drag danger to the canvas. So if I dragged default, or whatever that would be called in the end, I would have to toggle in that new type on top of deciding what variant it is. So we have primary, neutral, subtle. There would also be a type for scheme, is what we originally called it, on top, and it just felt confusing. Additionally, we probably would have ended up bundling all of them into one, because the argument might be, if those are together, why is everything not together and just separated by a variant switch? In which case you make larger components which get less performant, they take longer to load. Like performance was also a consideration.
That makes sense. I feel like especially pulling out danger makes sense, because as you're designing, it's not like one button's going to like temporarily become dangerous or really switch back and forth a lot. They are like so different and used for very different things. So pulling in a separate component makes sense to me versus just changing like the state or tweaking it.
Yeah. I've also just flipped into dev mode, and they are actually different components in dev mode too, on the code. Okay. So button danger is its own component with its own logic, and button regular or just button is its own as well. Same with icon button is its own component. And then the button group is its own component, which inherits whichever button configuration you're taking in there. So the handoff piece is actually aligned. They're pretty one-to-one.
Nice. Did you ever consider for the button, the brand button, to pull apart the three different emphases, the default or the, bold, subtle, and ghost, to be like separate component sets?
Yeah. Ideally, we would have just shipped one, and that would have been the top left one. But we just know that some people like to have button groups with a subtler version alongside one. And that was pretty difficult to get right, because this border had to be a certain ratio to meet accessibility guidelines. And when you put it at, that's a pretty dark border, right? Which actually does make it stand out more than maybe you traditionally have. There are systems where you might have these two together with no border because it's subtle, but that doesn't pass the guidelines of like the background / border on the white or the gray. So we had to make that call of them being that level of contrast. But yeah, it's mostly one of those, yeah, I think people probably need this, but the system might not. So shipping what you might define as like the minimum viable component set.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's easier to just use or simpler to keep them all bundled up together as one button versus maybe 3 different types of buttons?
Yeah, and there is an argument too that the size should be split into different ones, different variants, like a medium one and a small one, and then on the assets panel you'd see them. But again, it's just let's just ship it and see how it lands, and then we might make that change later.
Yeah, I feel like so many of those things come down to just like the preference of a team as well.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, let's see. Were there any kind of like big aha moments while you were designing this system of something you were expecting, or just like you figured out something, or I don't know, any surprises?
An aha moment. I think, honestly, back to one of the earlier questions of the typography semantic collection, that ended up saving so much time on the style side that I just thought, oh, why have I never thought of that before? And it was Jake who actually suggested, because he was looking at the styles and looking at me going like one by one, changing the font family. He's like, outsource it to the collection. And it ended up being really efficient. That was like, oh, wow, yeah, that actually is really useful. I think maybe on the component side, went back so many times back and forth on the notification component of what is it? What is a notification? How many different styles should it be? How many different schemes should it be? Should it be in different positive, negative, whatever variations? And just constantly aligning that it needs to be pared down as much as possible. This is simple. So maybe it's fine just having a white one and a red one and not needing all these different variations. So again, not necessarily groundbreaking aha moment, but for looking at system requirements, it's so easy to just jump straight in and be like, we need X variations of every single thing, because of course you're going to need a yellow warning message component. So maybe you actually don't. Maybe you don't need that until you do.
I think, especially with yellow, I feel like I've had a lot of aha moments. I've had a lot of students with them too. When I finally asked, realistically, how often do you use yellow in your product? You have a live product. Show me the yellow. Does it need to be accessible in these ways or used in these ways, or are you just inventing hypotheticals?
Yes.
And a lot of times it's just so many hypotheticals and we're not actually using the colors of the things in the ways that we're trying to plan for.
Yeah. And I think just another one is the card. They're very difficult to make a generic but specific yet configurable but not card thing. And it ended up being, this went back and forth loads of times as well about what should be in the card variant. And it ended up just being as simple as we possibly could, like a horizontal and vertical variant, which actually also, I think, just collapses into vertical anyway. So they're shipped as different versions, but they're similar. But you might be looking for a specific one. But I think maybe the minor aha moment was shipping the card, but also shipping specific composed versions of it. So you can see how you might make your own one if you were to make one based off this system. So these would all share the same. Actually, they don't. So the product info card doesn't have the same padding as the pricing card or the same margin, but it shows you that you can make variations of the same like primitive component and still be a card using the system variables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try and describe it sometimes as like flexible versus rigid components. Like we have like an ultra flexible card that can like do whatever you want to do, and then like really rigid ones where it's, okay, this is for the profile though, and we can only change the name in the photo. Everything else should just, doesn't even need a property. It should just stay as it is.
Yeah, we have that as well. There's a page at the bottom of forms. It's very similar to the cards one, where there's a bunch of composed forms that that probably every single team would need at some point a login screen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, there's the login form. You don't need to bring in the input field and the button and make it every time.
Yeah, it's nice to have that kind of ready-made. When you're building this system, were there any resources or tools that you feel were really helpful to lean on? I know you referenced the Atlassian system as maybe a good example, or like a plugin, or I don't know, anything that you found helpful.
Yeah. Every large design system I was consulting with very regularly. So the Atlassian one, the Adobe one, I jump into Polaris every so often just to see what they're doing. But mostly the large well-known systems, I'd go and reference their naming convention. And I'd find that through component.gallery, the website.
Mm-hmm.
That has a bunch of components which you can click, and it will have a massive table of systems that have that component in them. And the amount of like tabs that I would open to just check what do they call this thing, so I can maybe meet them in the middle somewhere. And the alert or message or notification thing is a great example of that, because that name is different in every system. So
Mm-hmm.
jumping through that was maybe just a little bit reassuring that it doesn't need to be the perfect name. It just needs to be a name that people are familiar with, as well as those tags or aliases that we put in the naming convention. And then I probably used like every color generator plugin in Figma's history. I was mostly looking for, I can't remember the name. There's a few ones that align to the APCA color contrast ratio. I
Did
didn't
you
end
use
up.
Leonardo? That's a good one.
I did use Leonardo, yeah. I didn't end up using the generations from it, but it was useful to just feel like where things are.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that, actually, I didn't use any of the generations of these plugins. It was mostly just, what can I do here? And how can I test these things? There's some really good color contrast ones, like color contrast checkers for APCA community. I just can't remember the names off the top of my head.
Yeah, I know like contrast is a good one. A lot of the names are very obvious,
Yeah.
which is helpful. Nice. I know I've gone over a bit. Are there any final questions in the chat that you saw and want to get to?
No, I don't think so.
Nice. This is so helpful. I'm so excited to take all these learnings and pour them into UI prep and also my course. And
yeah, no problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so helpful. This is so lovely. And yeah, thanks again. I'll see you around.
Thank you.